Welcome back to the Miami Real Estate Podcast powered by Cervera Real Estate. Today, we have your economic insights with Dr. Marci Rossell, Chief Economist, leading real estate companies of the world.
Marci, thank you for being there, no matter the time zone, as always. So we have a lineup of topics for you guys today. We are going to hit, obviously, the big topic for anybody in the States right now, and a lot of our global folks as well. It's gonna impact things across the world, which is the upcoming U.S. election. And there's been some news out of the U.S. Just in the last couple of days around surprising mortgage rate blips, and we're gonna get it all to you in the next half hour, guys. So thank you so much for being here. Marci, thank you for being here. And let's start with the election. We're keeping it neutral here, but the economy is such a big topic for this election for obvious reasons. It always is, but it feels heightened this time. And Marci, what I'd like to do is sort of help folks arm themselves with how to work through some of the policies that are on both sides of the table. And we have a slide for you today. So Marci, take it away.
When it comes to elections, I like to make the joke all the time that every 4 years, Americans are sort of inundated with all kinds of terrible policy ideas, right? That's what elections are. And then I don't blame candidates.
On both sides of the aisle.
Both sides of the aisle. That's right. Everybody wants to get elected, right? So as a voter, what do you do? How do you sort of understand, if you don't have a PhD in economics, how can you figure out, well, is this a good idea or a bad idea? So that's why I just came up with a quick chart to help us kind of evaluate some of the things that are on the table this year, not just in the US election, but there have been elections around the world. So more people voted this year in elections than any other time in history. And so whether you're living in India or China or Italy or the US, you all have to sort of face this idea of, how do I figure out if it's a good idea or not? So these are sort of my principles for figuring out, when I look at a policy, is it something, that I should get behind or not? So the first one is it even necessary? Is it a necessary policy? Is there actually a problem? Because a lot of times what can happen in elections, and again, I'm talking nonpartisan here, every politician does it. It doesn't matter who you are. You basically go, I want people to vote for me, so let me figure out a way to get them on my side, right? So we use economic policies to do it. But from a really narrow economic point of view, government should get involved in the economy when markets have failed to provide an efficient outcome. Now, there's a lot of jargon there, so let me kind of work you through what I mean by that, and maybe give you some examples. Policies are actually necessary because markets have failed to provide an efficient outcome. The simplest one for everyone to understand is that if we were all left on our own individually, we don't have an ability or an incentive to build roads, right? So government gets together and collects our tax dollars and provides roads, public goods that we can all use. Other examples of that are national defense, right? If you just left it to free markets, you probably wouldn't have an army, right? But instead, governments get together and they use our tax dollars to provide something that markets on their own won't provide. Now, when it comes to things like regulation, why would you ever regulate the stock market, right? Well, you regulate the stock market and all sorts of things because as individuals, we can't have full information. It's either too costly, too hard, or we just can't do it. So if I didn't believe that the stock market was being regulated so that companies behaved in a fair and free manner, I might not be willing to invest in stocks. Yet as a society, we want to have a stock market. So that's an example of times when government intervention is necessary, because if markets were left to their own devices, you wouldn't have an efficient outcome. Now, we can argue all day long, and this is where politics and your own point of view start to come in, about whether something is necessary or not. That's the nature of politics, but that's the place to start. So let's say we all agree that something is necessary, right? So you have to tax people one way or another. Now, I'm going to be honest, I don't like taxes any more than the rest of you do. But we have to agree that if we're going to have some public goods, we got to have taxes. So when you do get ready to tax people, you have to ask yourself, Can you tax them in a way that's neutral, meaning you don't favor one group of voters over another? And this is when elections get really, really busy and start to produce policies that do tend to favor one group or the other. So I'm going to give you two examples from the American election, and they're going to be you'll be able to recognize them. And so they're from both sides of the aisle. So again, I point my fingers at everyone. There is a policy that's been proposed to exempt tips from income taxes, right? And so that's a policy that's so boldly not neutral. It's not treating it's treating one group of voters who earn their wages in a particular way in a different way than you do other types of income. By the way, we do that with hedge fund managers who are allowed to claim that their carried interest is actually not income. And so it gets taxed at a lower rate. So this is another example of a policy that truthfully is not neutral, just giving you a little my 2 cents in, but that's not part of the election right now. Then there are policies that propose to forgive student loans. Well, that's clearly not neutral either, because there are lots of people out there who took student loans and have already paid them off. Lots of people whose parents paid for their education in other ways, so they never took student loans out. So giving forgiveness to a group of people who, and a very narrow group of folks who took out student loans, wouldn't be considered a neutral policy. So by my criteria, that would fail when it comes to a good public policy. So I'm giving you sort of two examples, both sides of the aisle, to sort of chew on there. And then it comes to, so we're getting more and more granular, right? So it may be necessary, it may be neutral, but then you ask yourself, does the benefit exceed the cost? And this is when calculations of how policies will contribute to the budget deficit become very, very important. Now, again, you can do that research on your own. There are wonderful, unbiased organizations that look at how policies will contribute to the deficit. The Bipartisan Policy Organization is just one of them that I'll throw out there to you. The Peterson Institute does really good work in this area as well. So those are two examples of people that I would consider good sources of information for the cost of public policies, and are they worth it? And then the last thing, and again, this brings us back to the realm of politics. And you won't hear me say this often, but some things aren't about economics. I hate to admit that because I'm an economist, and I'd like to think that everything is about economics. But some things are about national security. They don't have anything to do with economics. And a national security concern may override economics when it comes to a policy. And this gets us to some extent into the realm of when to apply tariffs to certain technologies. I tend to be a pretty free market economist, and candidates around the globe are embracing tariffs as a way to sort of manage economies. And I'm going to tell you, friends, all that does is create higher prices for everyone. There are a few things that all economists agree on. That one's just kind of easy, right? But sometimes tariffs matter from a national security point of view. Sometimes you regulate certain types of things, like, say, nuclear weapons, right? I mean, there's no reason why government should control them other than that they're really dangerous. So it doesn't have anything to do with economics. It has more to do with security. Maybe a policy has to do with the environment, again, outside the realm of economics. Maybe it has to do with climate. Maybe it has to do with some perceived economic fairness as well. And again, this is when politics meets up with issues in a way that is beyond what economics can tell you.
Phenomenal. I love that infrastructure for us to think through what will be a bombardment of various opinions over the next couple of weeks and beyond. There was, of course, the announcement of the Nobel Prize. And big picture here, continuing a little bit more, but you and I chatted a little bit before the show about what the study was that won the Nobel Prize, two MIT professors, a professor at the University of Chicago. And I think it's such an important study given everything that's happening in the world today. So many lessons there. Break it down for us.
The Nobel Prize in economics always is a big deal for people like me. I will never win one, unfortunately, but it's a prize that typically the research that it gives a prize to is typically very old research, right? So this was a paper that was written in 2001. So it's a 20-year-old piece of research, but it stood the test of time. And it was fascinating for the following reason. it's really hard to do a controlled experiment on the economy, right? So you can say, well, this policy will have this effect, this policy will have that effect, but it's really hard to know because economies don't operate in a vacuum. You can't do a lab experiment on the economy. But these economists said, we're still really curious. What if some countries grow and some don't? Because there are models out there that suggest over time with technological diffusion, all economies should eventually grow at the same rate. But we know, for instance, that sub-Saharan Africa, their GDP per person has been flat since the 1970s. So it isn't the case that all countries grow. It isn't the case that standards of living always increase. And so they said, well, why? Can we look historically at something? And they went back and they looked at European colonization around the globe in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. They looked at when European colonists sort of went out and explored the globe, colonized. There were some places where mortality rates were very, very high for the settlers. So I want to be clear, we're talking about the settlers' point of view, not the inhabitants who were there already, right? Because the mortality rates for those folks were always extremely high. I'll be clear about that. But the settlers themselves found some climates where they could live and adapt and settle permanently, and some places where they couldn't. So, for instance, Australia, Canada, the US were three colonies where European colonists went and stayed because they could. There were many places in Central and South America and in Africa where the mortality rates for the colonists were so high that they couldn't stay and live there permanently. And so two different types of institutions were developed in these colonial areas. If the settlers stayed, they set up strong property rights and rule of law. So, and democratic institutions, right? That was what they did if they stayed there. Unfortunately, if they couldn't stay there because the mortality rates were so high because of the climate, the disease, all those things, they set up no property rights and extractive economies. So basically, they took everything and left, but they didn't stay there. So two types of systems taking place. What they found was that whatever system was put into place persisted, even after independence. So if you look at the US, Canada, Australia, even after independence from the English Empire, the institutions that were put into place have been basically adhered to. And unfortunately, the lack of rule of law, the lack of property rights have persisted in those extractive economies as well. And they tied this to economic growth today. And the reason you and I want to talk about this, and the reason it's important is, again, we have an opportunity to protect our institutions all the time. Now, again, politics is the discussion of how we best do that. And remember, I said discussion. We're here to discuss, right? Calmly and nicely with one another. That's what we do here. But I love the fact that the Academy recognized this and said, these institutions, they matter, and they matter for the long haul. And for those of us who enjoy them, we should be very grateful for them.
Beautifully said, Marci. Okay, so let's continuing sort of on the global front of the minute here is, of course, China. We've been keeping our eye on China. Once again, we're seeing that we're continuing to see the Chinese economy cool. I know they're working hard to try to right size things, but it almost feels at this point like it's an impossible slide. Can you give us some perspective?
The world is, I think, finally waking up to a problem that has been going on for about 4 years now. So it is not new. The decline in housing prices in China has been going on for 4 years now. It has contributed to a deflationary spiral, a lack of consumer confidence, and a Chinese consumer that is basically not willing to get out there and spend money because they understand that their economy is getting weaker and weaker, and it will take probably, by some estimates, another 4 years for house prices to stabilize. So this is a much larger, in terms of size, decline in housing prices and in the housing market than what we saw globally during the 2008-2009 Great Recession that affected most economies around the world. But if you sort of recall, the Chinese economy back then was relatively unscathed. They did not experience the housing bust back in 2008, 2009 that many countries around the world have already dealt with. So maybe one way to sort of look at this is that it's a delay of the 2008, 2009, 2010 housing bust that the rest of the world has experienced already. I mean, that's one way to look at it. Now, in terms of the Chinese government's attempts to deal with the problem, um, they are putting into place policies to attempt to get the homes built that builders promised people that they've already paid for that haven't been built, which is one way to immediately restore confidence. And I think that matters in kind of putting a floor underneath the problem. It's going to cost a lot of money. And the best analysis that I've seen so far suggests they're about halfway there. So it's not going to be cheap. It's not going to be easy. And it will be a drag on their economy overall, coming at a time when the world is moving away from that globalization, that free trading that China benefited so much from over the last 20 years. So I am not, I tend to be an optimist, right? I mean, you guys all know this about me, but I am very concerned about how the world responds to China's economic problems because we all know there are tensions between China and Taiwan. We're all aware of those. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but the best minds politically that I have seen on this suggest that we have to do our best to keep the Chinese economy in the global trading system because you don't want to give them nothing to lose. That you have to have a system where China feels like they have something to lose if they do something to upset their trading partners. So I want us to keep that in mind as we're evaluating what are the right public policies to put into place to deal with the Chinese economy. And we have to give them something to lose.
All right, let's turn to the U.S. economy, the U.S. housing market. Now, there have been some interesting sort of flags, some red, some green, some yellow, just even within the last 24 hours. And so I want to kind of talk through those. First of all, mortgage rates. Like we saw the Fed's cut more than I was anticipating. We are like, oh, no, mortgage rates are going to go down. They're going to keep going down. It's just going to be this big, happy slide into a warm bath. I know you didn't, Marci, but, I think there was a lot of enthusiasm. We're watching just now a bump up in mortgage rates. What happened? Why? And is this a cause for alarm or is this just part of the process?
It is part of the process. I got to tell you guys that basically markets, prices, just interest rates, they're just the price of securities. And just like stock prices rarely go one direction up all the time, every movement up is like this, and every movement down is like this. So mortgage rates didn't go to 7% in a steady incline. They went up a little bit, and then they came down, and then they go up, and then they go down. So while the weekly gyrations and daily gyrations of mortgage rates matter deeply for everyone in this room, I totally understand that at this point in the game, everyone is very sensitive to what's happening on a day-to-day basis. But at the same time, I can tell you with great confidence that as the Federal Reserve brings rates down over the next 6 months, where we're probably going to have another 75 basis points of cuts, so that will take the Fed funds target rate down to 4%. That brings mortgage rates down to between 5 and 5.5. Now, it's not going to be a steady path to that sort of landing, but that's where things are headed. Now, you probably sort of, because you guys are all smart and you all work in this industry, understand that if I know that and you know that and clients know that, then you're probably going to have some folks that say, well, then maybe I'll just wait until rates go to 5%, right? And so then it becomes sort of having to use all those techniques that Jessica and everybody else talked to you about how to sort of close in an environment like this, because it does make your job much harder, right? That we are now in an environment where rates are moving down. And this can be another reason why people want to postpone either buying or selling. And this is when other techniques beyond economics are sort of where you have to go to answer those questions. And that's why we have all the resources, right, Jess?
That's right, Marci. And positive selling point for buyers and sellers right now that have just come up. One of them is that we've got good news in the inventory front, right? We have just stats from NAR just from the last couple of days, 6.4 higher percent homes on the market than last month and 33.6% higher year over year. I mean, that's some good news. And adding to the happy inventory news, just within the last hour, we've seen housing starts. So can you sort of talk us through how that's looking for us too?
Absolutely. So the headline on housing starts was actually negative. But again, you can't look at headlines, right? You have to look down into the data because housing starts have multifamily and single family in the statistic. And when you broke them out, multifamily housing starts were lower, but single family starts were higher, right? They actually grew. And so as we have sort of beat this drum over and over and over again, that the key to righting the housing market and getting back to normal markets that are affordable, right? And there's all kinds of ideas about what affordability means, but we kind of all know this ain't it, right? So basically, you need more supply. The biggest problem for American housing, and I've argued this in front of all sorts of audiences, I actually believe the biggest problem in American from the economy point of view today is that we don't have enough houses to shelter every single person in this country one way or another. Housing is the biggest problem in my mind economically, and you've just got to buy more. And again, it gets back to how to judge a policy proposal. Will the proposal actually solve the problem, right?
We need shovels in the ground.
That's just it, over and over and over again. You got to put more shovels in the ground. And so today was good news. But if you look sort of long term, it's just still not enough. We need millions, millions, millions and millions and millions of new houses being built. And every policy that makes that easier, as an economist, I'm personally going to get behind. So we do have good news. It also is some proof, right, that economics is still real. You know, sometimes if, you say, look, if interest rates go down, that'll stimulate the housing market and then they go down and it doesn't, then you're like, well, oh my gosh, maybe economics doesn't really work. So at least we have some evidence that economics is real. As interest rates have come down, we have seen happen what we would expect to happen. But because interest rates have only been cut once, guys, it's just a 50 basis point cut. You're going to get 75 basis points more, and that's going to continue to add to this loosening up, the increase in building, and you need more multifamily and you need more single family, and lower interest rates are what will deliver those things to us.
Great, Marci. So we're almost at the bottom of the hour. We're deep in sort of business planning, even on the tail end of it, depending on which shop you're sitting in. Do you have thoughts on sort of how we can be getting our mind around the spring market, which is always sort of the classic happy place in our industry for 2025, given all of the uncertainties that we're facing right now?
Well, first of all, I don't think whoever gets elected in a month is going to make that much difference to your spring market. So I just want to be clear about that. First of all, that it may make a difference into how you personally view the economy, because as we've talked about before, if your team wins the White House, you tend to think the economy's great. And if your team loses the White House, you tend to think the economy's terrible. And nothing about the reality of the economy tends to change that for a lot of folks, unfortunately. But you're all here, and I think you're here because you really want to know what's really going on with the economy. So that's probably not you, but it is going to be your clients. So knowing your clients, knowing where they stand, and knowing what kind of tools you will have to use with them, what you're going to have to message based on how they're going to feel about the economy, that quite frankly has nothing to do with the reality, unfortunately, is going to be a challenge for each and every one of you. So that being said, that's part of what needs to go into your spring planning is your messaging. Messaging this way for this type of client, messaging this way for this type of client, depending on how they are feeling about the economy. And facts matter, but we know we're in a business that's facts plus. So that's the first thing that I would say about spring markets. But again, if the Federal Reserve cuts rates another 75 basis points, This stimulates home building. This stimulates inventory. This gets buyers and sellers moving again. So I think spring could be, really exciting time based on those things.
And actually, it was like you and Adam have some sort of mental telepathy going on, because he just asked about that. Adam, no, we hadn't addressed this yet. He's asking about the timeline for that. So when will the 75 basis points come? Do you have any thoughts on?
The Federal Reserve meets at the next, I expect that you'll see 25 at the next meeting, 25 at the next meeting, and 25 at the next meeting. I think the 50 basis points was a bit of a surprise. And if the economy was deteriorating dramatically, I would say they would do another 50 basis point, but everything's kind of holding steady. So typically the Federal Reserve moves incrementally, and I have nothing to suggest that they won't do that this time around.
So what about, and this is about sort of the urban areas, revitalization, conversions, etc. What about renovating existing historic properties in urban areas versus building new construction to help solve? And of course, we get into zoning questions. We could do a whole one on this, but just sort of your quick thoughts on that.
As the office space has gone into decline, it's just an reuse, simple urban planning to take that empty space and use all those creative architectural tricks to turn it into what we really need in these urban areas, which is residential real estate. So again, 100% behind it. And if I use my sort of public policy, should we make zoning possible? Should we use sort of public support to do that? Again, politics helps you answer some of those questions. But for me personally, the necessary part, oh, absolutely, there's clearly a market failure. And it just really comes down to the cost benefit analysis of each one of those individual projects.
Roofs over families. What is the effect of income tax cuts on the economy?
It depends on if they are neutral, right? So do you cut for one group and not another? And you have to basically look at the specific proposal, right? Because just cutting rates is different from increasing deductions, right? So they're both a tax cut, but they operate in very, very different ways. But I'm going to tip my hand and just tell you guys, as an economist, I would, from an economic efficiency point of view, see us go to either a flat tax or some type of national sales tax rather than taxing income the way we do today. Those kinds of dramatic proposals are not on the table. Everybody's sort of taking the existing system, which is extremely inefficient and costly. And this is something else that I sort of didn't sort of put into my slide. But simplicity and ease of compliance are two other principles when it comes to good public policy. And the state of our income tax system is neither simple or easy to comply with. And so there are bigger alternatives. Now, adjusting tax rates in one way or another depends on the effect that it has on the deficit. And it depends on the effect that it has on incentives to work, save, and all those sorts of things. So I'd have to see a specific proposal and sort of run it through a model, which is something I don't do, but I can have other people do it. But in general, the income tax system we have today, just as an aside, is extremely inefficient. There are better ways to do it.
Marci, thank you. We appreciate you. Again, you have our Nobel Prize.